The thermometer read 42 degrees below zero when Caleb McCord realized his cabin's chimney was completely blocked with ice. He had 9 more days until the supply wagon would attempt the mountain pass. 9 days of the worst cold snap Montana had seen in 20 years. Without a functioning fireplace, the cabin would become a tomb. What Caleb built in the next 6 hours, using nothing but his axe, his firewood pile, and the snow that threatened to bury him alive, would introduce a shelter technique so effective that trappers and prospectors across the northern Rockies would use it for the next 40 years. Before we see how Caleb survived, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from and what the coldest temperature you've ever experienced is. And if stories of frontier survival fascinate you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's story might just save your life someday. December 18, 1853. Caleb McCord woke to a cabin filled with smoke and a fire that wouldn't draw. He stumbled to the door, threw it open, and stepped into pre-dawn darkness so cold it felt like breathing broken glass. The thermometer nailed to the exterior wall read 42 below zero. In the dim light of his oil lamp, Caleb circled his small cabin and immediately saw the problem. Ice had formed inside his stone chimney during the night, a thick plug that completely blocked the flue. The moisture from cooking, from his own breathing, from the firewood itself, had condensed in the chimney's throat, frozen solid, and created an impenetrable barrier. This wasn't unusual in extreme cold. Chimneys iced up regularly during severe weather. The solution was typically simple. You let the fire die completely, climbed onto the roof, and broke the ice blockage free from above. It took an hour, maybe 2, and then you could rebuild your fire. Caleb had done it 3 times already this winter. But this morning was different. This morning, the wind was blowing 40 miles per hour out of the north, driving the temperature even lower with wind chill. The roof of his cabin, steeply pitched and covered with 2 feet of snow, was treacherous in good conditions. In this wind, in this cold, climbing up there would be suicide. Even if he managed to reach the chimney, his hands would freeze in minutes. He'd never be able to work the tools needed to break the ice free. Caleb stood in his doorway, lamp in hand, and assessed his situation with the cold clarity that extreme danger brings. He was 26 years old, a prospector working a played-out gold claim in the mountains west of what would later become Helena. His nearest neighbor was 12 miles away. The supply wagon that brought provisions from the settlement wouldn't attempt the mountain pass for another 9 days, not until after the new year. He had plenty of food. His firewood was stacked against the cabin's north wall, 3 cords of split pine and fir. His water supply was fine since he could melt snow. But without a working fireplace, he couldn't heat the cabin. And without heat in temperatures this extreme, he would freeze to death within 24 hours. He couldn't stay in the cabin with smoke filling it. The carbon monoxide would kill him before the cold did. He couldn't leave the fire burning because the smoke had nowhere to go. He couldn't extinguish the fire and wait for the weather to improve because the cabin would become uninhabitable in hours, and he couldn't risk climbing to the roof to fix the chimney. Caleb stepped back inside, closed the door, and forced himself to think. He had perhaps 6 hours before the cold became genuinely life-threatening. 6 hours to figure out how to survive 9 more days at 40 below zero without a functioning cabin. Most men would have panicked. Caleb had spent 3 winters in these mountains. He didn't panic easily. Caleb extinguished what remained of his fire and opened both the door and the single window to clear the smoke. The temperature inside the cabin dropped immediately. Within 10 minutes, he could see his breath forming thick clouds in the lamplight. Within 20 minutes, the water in his tin cup had a skin of ice forming on its surface. He closed the window but left the door cracked open. He needed to think, and he needed breathable air to do it. He sat on his wooden chair, wrapped in his heaviest wool coat and 2 blankets, and forced his mind to work through the problem systematically. Building a new shelter was impossible. There wasn't time to construct anything substantial enough to provide real protection. The trees were frozen solid, making them nearly impossible to cut. Even if he could fell trees and shape logs, any conventional shelter would take days to build, and he didn't have days. He had hours. Moving to his neighbor's cabin 12 miles away was equally impossible. In this cold, in this wind, he wouldn't make it 3 miles before exposure killed him. The snow was too deep for fast travel. The cold was too severe for extended exertion. He would sweat from the effort, the sweat would freeze against his skin, and he would die. Staying put was his only option. But staying put in a cabin he couldn't heat was just slower suicide. Caleb's mind went back to something he'd seen 2 winters earlier. He'd been checking his trap lines in late January after a heavy snow. The wind had created enormous drifts, some of them 12 to 15 feet high, packed so solid you could walk on top of them without breaking through. He'd been following a creek when he noticed something odd. Steam was rising from a hole in one of the drifts. He'd approached carefully, thinking perhaps a hot spring was venting beneath the snow. But when he looked into the hole, he found something different. A black bear, not fully hibernating, had dug into the snowdrift and created a den. The hole was perhaps 3 feet wide, leading back into the drift at a slight upward angle. The bear wasn't home. But what struck Caleb was the temperature. The air coming from that tunnel was noticeably warmer than the surrounding atmosphere. Not hot, not even truly warm, but warmer. Above freezing, certainly. The bear had created a shelter using nothing but packed snow, and that shelter was holding heat. Caleb had continued on his trapline that day, thinking little more about it. Bears denned in snow. That was natural. But now, sitting in his freezing cabin with a blocked chimney and 9 days until help arrived, that memory took on new significance. Snow, when packed properly, was an insulator. Snow-covered roofs kept cabins warmer than bare roofs. Snow piled against walls blocked wind. Eskimos in the far north built entire houses from snow. He'd heard stories from trappers who'd worked Alaska Territory, but Caleb had never built an igloo. He didn't know the technique. What he had seen was that bear den. A tunnel into packed snow could provide shelter warmer than the outside air. The snow itself would insulate against the wind. The enclosed space would trap body heat and heat from a small fire. And unlike his cabin, a snow shelter didn't require a chimney. The idea seemed insane, abandoning a perfectly good log cabin to burrow into a snowdrift like an animal. But the snowdrift against the north wall of his cabin was at least 10 feet high and packed solid. Caleb made his decision at 7 o'clock that morning. He had perhaps 5 hours of workable daylight, though in this storm, daylight was a relative term. The sky was the color of old iron, and the wind showed no signs of letting up. He dressed in every layer he owned. 2 pairs of wool socks, his heavy boots, long underwear, wool trousers, 2 wool shirts, his thick coat, a scarf wrapped around his face, and his fur-lined hat pulled low over his ears. He pulled on his leather work gloves, knowing they'd be inadequate, but having nothing better. He gathered his tools, his long-handled shovel, his short-handled spade, his axe, and a wooden bucket he could use to haul snow away from the excavation. He took a coil of rope, thinking he might need to mark the entrance or create some kind of guideline. He filled his pockets with matches wrapped in oilcloth, a small knife, and a stub of candle. If he was going to dig into a snowdrift, he wanted light and the means to make fire. The snowdrift against the north wall of his cabin was massive. Days of northwest wind had piled snow against the logs until the drift stood nearly 12 feet high at its peak. The drift extended outward from the cabin wall about 15 feet before tapering down to ground level. The snow was wind-packed, dense enough that Caleb could walk on its surface without sinking more than a few inches. This was good. Loose powder snow would collapse. Packed snow would hold its shape. Caleb studied the drift, trying to determine the best approach. He needed to dig into the face of the drift, not down from the top. A tunnel entrance at ground level would be easier to access and would naturally trap warmer air, since heat rises and cold air sinks. He selected a spot about 6 feet from the cabin wall, where the drift was thick enough to provide substantial insulation, but close enough that he could potentially access his firewood stacked against the cabin. He began digging. The first shovel stroke barely penetrated the surface. The snow was frozen nearly solid, more like cutting into packed earth than snow. Caleb adjusted his technique, chopping at the snow face with the edge of his shovel rather than trying to scoop it. Each impact sent a jarring shock up his arms. His breath came in ragged clouds that instantly froze into ice crystals on his scarf. After 10 minutes of hard work, he'd managed to create a divot perhaps 2 feet wide and 1 foot deep. At this rate, excavating a tunnel large enough to crawl into would take hours. His hands were already going numb inside his gloves. Caleb stopped, stepped back, and reassessed. The shovel wasn't the right tool for this. He needed something that could break up the packed snow more effectively. He retrieved his axe from where he'd leaned it against the cabin wall. The axe was meant for splitting wood, but its weight and sharp edge might work better against the frozen snow than the shovel's broad blade. He swung the axe into the snow face. It bit deep, sending chunks of compacted snow scattering. Caleb worked for 3 hours straight, alternating between the axe to break up the packed snow and the shovel to clear away the debris. The technique was brutally simple. Swing the axe into the snow face at a downward angle, creating fracture lines. Use the shovel to pry out the broken chunks. Haul the snow away in the bucket. Repeat. His arms burned with exhaustion. His shoulders ached. Sweat soaked through his inner layers despite the cold, and he knew this was dangerous. Wet clothing would kill him as surely as exposure. But he kept working because stopping meant dying. By 10 o'clock, he'd excavated a horizontal tunnel approximately 4 feet deep into the drift. The opening was roughly 3 feet wide and 2.5 feet high, just large enough to crawl through on hands and knees. The tunnel angled slightly upward as it penetrated deeper into the snow, following the natural slope of the drift. This upward angle was intentional. Caleb remembered that detail from the bear den. Cold air would sink and flow out the entrance, while warmer air would rise and collect in the back of the tunnel. Inside the excavation, the wind stopped completely. The packed snow walls blocked every breath of air movement. The silence was startling after hours of howling wind. Caleb crawled deeper into his tunnel, pushing the oil lamp ahead of him. The snow walls gleamed in the lamplight, crystalline and dense. He could see the layers where different snowfalls had accumulated, compressed together into a solid mass. The temperature inside the tunnel was noticeably different from outside, not warm, but calmer. The killing wind couldn't reach him here. He continued digging from inside the tunnel now, working in a cramped crouch. His goal was to create a chamber at the end of the tunnel, a space large enough to sit upright, to sleep, to tend a small fire. The work was harder in the confined space. Every axe swing had to be controlled to avoid hitting the tunnel ceiling. Every shovel load had to be passed back toward the entrance, then hauled out in the bucket. Progress slowed to inches per hour. By noon, Caleb had created a chamber approximately 6 feet deep, 4 feet wide, and just tall enough to sit upright without his head touching the ceiling. The tunnel entrance remained low and narrow, but the interior chamber was livable space. His muscles screamed with fatigue. His hands were raw inside his gloves. His face, despite the scarf, was windburned and probably frostbitten in places. But he had a shelter. The next critical step was ventilation. Caleb used the handle of his shovel to punch a hole upward through the chamber's ceiling. The shovel handle broke through after 3 feet of packed snow, creating a ventilation shaft roughly 2 inches in diameter. Cold air immediately flowed down through the hole. Caleb adjusted the angle, making the hole slightly larger. He needed enough ventilation to prevent carbon monoxide buildup from a fire, but not so much that heat would simply escape. Caleb crawled back out of the tunnel and assessed his situation. It was 1 o'clock in the afternoon, though the gray sky made it feel like late evening. He'd been working for 6 hours straight. His body was exhausted, but he wasn't finished. The tunnel existed, but it wasn't yet livable. He needed to make it functional before nightfall, and nightfall in December came early. He returned to his cabin and began gathering supplies. His bedroll and wool blankets came first, then his food supplies, dried meat, and hardtack and beans, enough for 10 days. His cooking pot and tin cup, his remaining oil lamp and fuel, matches, his rifle and ammunition, though he doubted he'd need them, extra clothing, a water skin. He made 3 trips, hauling everything through the snow and carefully pushing each bundle through the tunnel entrance into the chamber beyond. The next problem was firewood. His 3 cords of split wood were stacked against the cabin's north wall, now partially buried in the same drift he'd tunneled into. Caleb dug through the snow until he could access the woodpile. He selected pieces carefully, looking for splits that were straight and uniform. He needed wood that could serve double duty, both as fuel and as structural support. He carried armload after armload to the tunnel entrance, stacking pieces within easy reach. Inside the tunnel chamber, Caleb began the most important modification. He needed to reinforce the structure, particularly around the area where he'd have his clues: fire. Melting snow from fire heat could cause collapse. He took his straightest pieces of firewood and began embedding them into the snow walls, creating a framework. He placed thick pieces horizontally along the chamber walls, pressing them into the snow until they held firm. Then he added vertical supports, wedging split logs from floor to ceiling. The wood froze into place almost immediately in the sub-zero temperature, becoming part of the structure. Around the area where he planned his fire pit, Caleb built up the reinforcement. He created a corner framework using his largest pieces of firewood, essentially building a wooden sleeve inside the snow chamber. The wood would absorb and distribute heat, preventing the snow walls from melting too quickly. Between the wooden supports and the snow walls, he packed loose snow as additional insulation. The result was a hybrid structure, snow and wood working together. For the fire pit itself, Caleb dug down through the snow floor until he reached frozen earth. He lined this shallow pit with flat rocks he'd carried from beside his cabin. The rocks would retain heat and provide a stable base. Above the fire pit, directly below his ventilation hole, he arranged more pieces of wood into a crude chimney structure, creating a channel that would guide smoke upward toward the vent. By 4 o'clock, as gray daylight began fading toward darkness, Caleb's tunnel shelter was as ready as he could make it. He crawled out one final time, took one last look at his dark, cold cabin, and made his decision. He crawled back into the tunnel, pulling a large piece of canvas behind him to cover the entrance. Caleb knelt in his snow chamber and prepared to light his first fire. This was the crucial test. If the ventilation failed, if the chamber filled with smoke, if the heat melted the walls too quickly, the entire shelter would become unusable. He'd be forced back into the frozen cabin with no backup plan and dwindling time. His hands shook slightly as he arranged kindling in the stone-lined fire pit. The shaking wasn't entirely from cold, it was fear, controlled but present. He started small. A handful of dry pine needles and wood shavings formed the base. 3 small sticks arranged in a teepee shape above that. 2 slightly larger splits placed ready to add once the kindling caught. He struck a match, cupped his hands around the flame to protect it from the air current flowing down through the ventilation hole, and touched it to the pine needles. The fire caught immediately, small flames licking upward. Smoke rose from the kindling and drifted toward the ventilation hole Caleb had punched through the ceiling. Most of it found the opening and disappeared upward. Some smoke pooled along the chamber ceiling, spreading in a thin layer. Caleb watched carefully. If the smoke thickened, if it began filling the chamber, he'd have to extinguish the fire and redesign his ventilation. But after a minute, the smoke layer stabilized. The fire was drawing properly. Most of the smoke was escaping through the vent. He added his larger splits carefully, building the fire up gradually. As the flames grew, heat began radiating from the fire pit. Caleb could feel it on his face and hands, the first real warmth he'd experienced since waking that morning. The temperature in the chamber rose noticeably. Within 10 minutes, he could no longer see his breath. Within 20 minutes, he'd removed his outer coat. The snow walls that had seemed so cold and hostile now revealed their true nature. They were insulation, trapping the fire's heat inside the chamber. Caleb monitored the walls carefully, looking for signs of melting. A thin glaze of moisture appeared on the inner surface closest to the fire, but the wooden framework he'd installed absorbed most of the heat. The walls held their shape. The ceiling above the fire pit showed more melting, which was expected and why he'd created the wooden chimney structure. Water dripped occasionally, hissing when it hit the fire, but the drips were manageable. As darkness fell outside, Caleb's chamber became genuinely comfortable. The fire burned steadily, consuming wood slowly. The temperature stabilized somewhere around 40 degrees, warm enough to survive, cool enough that the snow structure remained solid. He melted snow in his cooking pot for water. He ate dried meat and hardtack. He spread his bedroll on the snow floor, laying down pine boughs first for insulation, then his blankets. The wind outside howled, driving the temperature down to 45 below zero. Inside his snow tunnel, Caleb sat warm by his fire, alive when by all logic he should be freezing. He'd survived the first critical test, but he had 9 more nights to endure. Caleb woke on the morning of December 19th to complete darkness. The tunnel entrance was covered with the canvas he'd hung the night before, and no natural light penetrated the snow walls. He lit his oil lamp and checked his surroundings. The fire had burned down to embers during the night, but the chamber remained tolerable, perhaps 35 degrees. His breath was visible again, but he wasn't shivering. The insulation had held through the night. He rekindled the fire, added fresh wood, and began his first full day living in snow. The challenges became apparent immediately. Space was severely limited. He could sit upright, but not stand. Movement required crawling or crouching. Everything he needed had to be within arm's reach because there was no room to organize supplies properly. His firewood pile, stacked near the entrance, took up a quarter of the available space. But as the day progressed, Caleb began understanding how to optimize his shelter. He discovered that by arranging his firewood along the walls, the wood itself became part of the structure. Each piece he removed for burning could be replaced with snow, maintaining the wall thickness. He carved shallow shelves into the snow walls, creating storage for his food supplies and tools. The shelves froze solid within minutes, becoming permanent fixtures. The ventilation hole became his primary concern. Too much airflow and heat escaped, too little and smoke accumulated. Caleb experimented throughout the morning, using wadded canvas to partially block the hole, then removing it when smoke thickened. He eventually found the right balance, a piece of canvas positioned to deflect direct airflow while still allowing smoke to escape. The solution was imperfect, requiring constant adjustment, but it worked. Water management presented another challenge. Melting snow for water was constant work. The pot had to remain near the fire, taking up valuable space. Caleb solved this by creating a dedicated alcove carved into the wall beside his fire pit. The alcove held his pot at an angle, allowing snow to melt while freeing up floor space. Simple adjustments like this made the confined space more livable. By afternoon, Caleb ventured outside to check conditions and retrieve more firewood. The temperature had dropped to 48 below zero. The wind continued unabated, creating whiteout conditions where visibility extended perhaps 20 feet. His cabin stood dark and silent, already drifting over with new snow. He could see his ventilation hole from outside, a small dark spot in the snow, drift with wisps of smoke rising from it. From even 30 feet away, the hole was nearly invisible. He gathered an armload of firewood and returned to his tunnel. The entrance was drifting closed, which Caleb realized was actually beneficial. The snow accumulating around the entrance created an additional wind barrier. He left it partially drifted, maintaining just enough opening to crawl through. Inside, the chamber felt almost cozy after the brutal cold outside. Caleb spent the evening refining his living space. He carved a second small alcove for his lamp, creating ambient lighting that didn't consume floor space. He arranged his bedroll more efficiently. He organized his food supplies. The tunnel was transforming from emergency shelter into functional living quarters. Days 3 through 7 blurred together in a routine of small, necessary tasks. Caleb woke in darkness, rekindled his fire, melted snow for water, ate a cold breakfast of dried meat and hardtack, and then spent hours maintaining his shelter. The maintenance was constant and crucial. Every day, he inspected the walls for weak spots where heat had caused excessive melting. He reinforced problem areas by packing fresh snow or adding more wooden supports. He cleared the ventilation hole when ice built up around its edges. He rotated his firewood, moving pieces from the cold entrance area to the warmer chamber so they'd dry before burning. The physical confinement was harder than the cold. Caleb was a man accustomed to movement, to walking trap lines and prospecting claims that covered miles of mountain terrain. Now, his entire world measured 6 feet by 4 feet. He couldn't stand. He couldn't pace. He couldn't escape the same walls, the same curved ceiling, the same small fire. His muscles cramped from the constant crouching. His back ached from sleeping on the hard snow floor despite the pine boughs and blankets. The mental challenge was worse. Hour after hour of silence broken only by wind howl and fire crackle, nothing to see but snow walls and firelight, nothing to do but feed the fire and wait. Caleb caught himself talking aloud just to hear a human voice. He recited poems he'd memorized as a child. He told stories to the walls. He sang songs his mother had taught him 20 years ago in Kentucky. The sound of his own voice kept him anchored, reminded him he was still human and not just another animal denned up in snow. On day 5, December 22nd, the temperature outside dropped to 52 below zero. Caleb measured it by venturing to his cabin and checking the thermometer, a trip that took less than 3 minutes but left his face stinging and his lungs burning. Inside his tunnel, the temperature held steady at 38 degrees. The fire burned constantly now. Caleb had abandoned any attempt to conserve wood. Survival meant staying warm, and staying warm meant feeding the fire. His firewood supply became a concern. He'd started with 3 cords, but the constant burning consumed wood faster than he'd anticipated. By his calculation, he had perhaps 4 more days of fuel at current consumption rates. The supply wagon was due in 4 days, on December 26th, assuming it could make the mountain pass in this weather. The math was close enough to be frightening. On day 7, December 24th, something changed. The wind stopped, not gradually, not slowly diminishing, but stopped completely in a matter of minutes. The sudden silence was startling after a week of constant howling. Caleb crawled to the entrance, pushed aside the canvas, and looked out. The sky was clearing. Stars were visible for the first time in 8 days. The temperature was still brutally cold, but without wind, the cold lost its killing edge. Caleb allowed himself the first small hope that he might actually survive this. December 26th dawned clear and impossibly cold. The thermometer read 47 below zero, but without wind, the morning felt almost peaceful. Caleb emerged from his tunnel into blinding sunlight reflecting off snow. His eyes, accustomed to a week of dim firelight and darkness, couldn't adjust. He squinted against the glare, shading his face with his hand, and looked down the mountain toward the pass. He couldn't see far enough to spot the supply wagon, but he knew it would come today if it came at all. The driver, a man named Peterson, kept a reliable schedule. Every 2 weeks during winter, weather permitting, Peterson drove his wagon up from the settlement with supplies for the scattered prospectors and trappers working claims in these mountains. He'd been doing it for 6 years. He knew these mountains, knew the dangers, and knew when conditions allowed passage. Caleb spent the morning preparing. He gathered his list of needed supplies, checked his remaining gold dust to pay for them, and kept watch on the trail. His tunnel shelter had saved his life, but he had no desire to spend another week living in it if he could repair his cabin's chimney. With the wind stopped, he could safely climb to the roof and break the ice blockage free. He'd have his cabin back. Life could return to normal. Around noon, he spotted movement on the trail below. The supply wagon, pulled by 2 horses, emerged from the tree line. Peterson was making the climb. Caleb felt relief wash over him, genuine and profound. He'd survived 10 nights in a snow tunnel. He'd endured temperatures that killed men. He'd solved an impossible problem with nothing but an axe, firewood, and determination. But survival had been lonely, and seeing another human being brought emotions Caleb hadn't expected. Peterson pulled the wagon up to Caleb's cabin an hour later. The old driver climbed down, stamped his feet to restore circulation, and stared at the snowdrift where Caleb had emerged. "McCord? That you? Where's your cabin?" "Cabin's there," Caleb said, pointing. "Chimney iced up 10 days ago. Couldn't fix it in the wind. Been living in the snow." Peterson walked closer to the drift, saw the tunnel entrance, the wisps of smoke from the ventilation hole, and shook his head slowly. "You've been living inside that snowdrift? For 10 days?" 10 nights, Caleb corrected. "Below zero the whole time. Got down to 52 on day 5. Peterson crouched by the tunnel entrance, peered inside, and whistled low. "I've seen men build snow shelters for overnight. Never heard of anyone living in one for more than a day or 2? You should be dead." "Snow's warmer than you'd think," Caleb said, "once you understand how it works." Peterson stood, brushed snow from his knees, and looked at Caleb with the kind of respect frontier men reserved for genuine achievement. "You need to tell people about this, McCord. There's trappers and prospectors all over these mountains. Next time someone's cabin fails in a cold snap, this could save their life." Caleb didn't set out to teach anyone his technique. He simply told the story when asked, which happened more frequently than he expected. Peterson spread word through the settlement about the prospector who'd lived 10 days in a snowdrift at 40 below. Other trappers and prospectors, hearing the tale, sought Caleb out during winter gatherings. They wanted details. How deep did you dig? How did you ventilate it? What about the fire? Did the walls melt? How much wood did you burn? Caleb answered every question honestly. He explained the tunnel entrance design, the upward angle, the chamber dimensions. He described using firewood as structural reinforcement, creating a hybrid shelter of snow and wood. He emphasized the importance of ventilation, of monitoring smoke and adjusting airflow constantly. He admitted his mistakes, the things he'd learned through trial and error during those 10 desperate nights. He never claimed expertise. He'd simply survived through necessity and observation. The technique spread organically through the frontier community. The winter of 1854 saw 3 separate incidents where trappers used snow tunnel shelters to survive equipment failures or unexpected storms. A man named Davidson built one after his cabin burned. 2 prospecting partners named Chen and Morrison used the technique when caught 20 miles from shelter during a blizzard. All survived. All credited the method they'd heard about from Caleb McCord. By 1856, what frontier people called McCord tunnels had become recognized emergency shelter throughout the northern Rockies. The technique appeared in informal survival knowledge passed between mountainmen. Trading posts kept notes on the method for travelers heading into winter territory. Army scouts learned it as standard cold weather survival training. The shelter design wasn't revolutionary. Eskimos had used snow structures for generations, but Caleb's innovation was adapting that principle using materials and tools common to frontier prospectors. Firewood as structure, packed snow as insulation, simple tools, rapid construction. Caleb himself left the mountains in 1858. His gold claim never paid out, and he'd tired of winters that tried to kill him. He moved to Sacramento, married a woman named Sarah Chen, and ran a general store for 30 years. He rarely spoke about his prospecting days. When customers occasionally recognized his name and asked about the snow tunnel story, he'd confirm it happened, but offered few details. It was simply something he'd done to survive, nothing more. But the technique persisted long after Caleb forgot about it. Into the 1870s and 80s, frontier guides included descriptions of emergency snow shelters built using the McCord method. Prospectors heading to Alaska goldfields in the 1890s learned the technique before departing. Winter expedition teams in the early 20th century used variations of the design. The specific details evolved and adapted, but the core principle remained. Snow and wood combined properly could create shelter that sustained life in temperatures that should kill. Caleb McCord died in Sacramento in 1912 at age 85, surrounded by children and grandchildren who knew him only as a quiet shopkeeper. His obituary made no mention of mountains or snow tunnels, but in the high country where he'd nearly frozen, his legacy remained carved into memory and practice, a simple solution to an impossible problem.